Welcome to Perspectives with Asima Silva. As you know, with this show, we do a lot of different kinds of shows. Some are political, some are educational, some are really covering hot topics, some are inspirational and motivational. Today is a little bit of a combination of all of it, with a little bit of history of our country, and some of the history in a good sense and a bad sense, in the sense of some of the horrors that we have experienced in this country, but a motivational part of it is how someone can overcome it and surpass those kind of horrific incidents. Today we have Dan McKenzie, who is ICNA's Director of Outreach and Programming, and he's here to share with us his own personal story about surviving one of the most horrific incidents in the United States, a mass murder at a nightclub where he lost two of his close family members. So thank you, Dan, for coming and joining us today and sharing your personal story. A full disclosure to our audience, I heard this story from Dan personally when we were on a road trip to DC for various other causes that we were doing. And we happened to stop by in New York to get a bite to eat. And Dan very nicely asked, do you mind if we stop by this monument? I'd like to honor my family members. And that's where this conversation started. And I thought this was a great story that everyone should be aware of and at least have a chance to listen to, because it is a very interesting story in the sense of all the details and challenges and life experiences that this story brings. But it also has a little bit of a learning experience from this. We all need to learn from it. And before we lose any more time, so Dan, if you'd like to, first of all, introduce yourself, talk about a little bit about your history and background.
Yeah, I'm Dan McKenzie. I was born and raised in the city of Boston. Very unique neighborhood. It was a dead-end street apartment complex. What I didn't know then was that it was a very small microcosm of shared experiences, even though we had very diverse neighbors from all corners of the world, from Cambodia to Haiti to Ireland to the Central America. We all shared poverty. So we were in Section 8 housing, all government assisted living. I was born and raised in this neighborhood, and we didn't move out till we were 14. I would say that there was about 300 kids in this dead-end street. So it was actually a great place to live. We didn't know what we were missing because we were all sharing the same experiences. But now that I'm older and that I help with social services, and I realized that I was the one that was waiting in line for, a can of peanut butter, a bag of rice, a carton of milk, a cereal with no name on it. And that was the experience we shared with these 300 kids. There was probably about 5 male figures within the complex. We were all
five, just
five. Five, yeah.
To how many kids?
About 300, kids. I'd say we were all raised by single mothers for the most part. And if there was a male in the household, it wasn't a very healthy relationship. When the police lights would come down the street, we were just wondering whose father was going to be, arrested that evening. So, but we formed a very tight-knit community. It was the type of community where my mother would just yell out for me from one window, and then the neighbor would hear her calling for me and then go to the back of her window and call out to me in the park. And everyone would look out for each other. We'd share ketchup.
It was their cell phones.
No, there was no cell phones.
No, I'm saying it was their form of cell phone.
Yeah. It was the neighborhood communication, and being so tight knit, we always felt safe. We weren't aware to a lot of the other, problems that were plaguing a lot of Boston at the time. Like I said, we were on the dead end street. One way in, one way out. So if you didn't have any business being there, you probably wouldn't come down there. So everybody knew everybody. We all looked out for each other. My father was an immigrant from Honduras, which you hear a lot in the news now. Escaped. It was probably the poorest country in the world at the time that he came here in the 70s. He came first to New Orleans, and then he spent time in the Bronx, New York. He brought his sisters up, and then they moved to Boston, and one sister remained in the Bronx. He met my mother here. They got married and they had me. Their relationship didn't last very long, so I was one of those single parent households. My mother remarried and had 2 more siblings. Inside our house, unfortunately, we witnessed a lot of violence, a lot of domestic violence, all kinds of violence in the home, which, like I said, was not uncommon. So what would happen is my father I would see him sporadically. But what he would do with me all throughout my childhood was take me to New York, to the Bronx, to visit my aunt that had remained there. So my aunt had a son that was 2 months younger than me. So we were, best friends, close, able to play and hang out. And so one time, I was 13, and my father, he had called me a couple weeks before and said, I'm going to take you down to your aunt's house. We'll go visit her. And it was, it was something that I was used to. But unfortunately, also what I was used to was sometimes he wouldn't show up when he said he would. So he went down to the Bronx that weekend. And I came home from church. My mother raised me as a Christian. And when I came home, she was crying. And I said, what's wrong? And she said, your father's dead. And I said, what? She said, oh, Sammy's dead. And at the time, I think I had a...
How old were you at this time?
I was 13 then, but I already had a unique relationship with understanding death. I had heard about it. I learned about death not the way most people do. The first story that I had to contemplate at a very young age, and I don't even know why I knew this story, probably around 4 or 5, was my stepfather's family in Alabama. When he was 18, he had, there were 6 of them, so they were all 2 years apart. He was the oldest, so he was 18 years old. The next one was 16, 14, 12, 10, and 8. And one time he came home, he was drunk, got into a fight with the 16-year-old brother. His mother took them all in a car to go look for his father, to come home and control the situation. This was in a very backwoods part of Alabama, very rural, no paved roads. And it was around Christmas time, and there was Christmas lights around the train track lights. And so they went over the train tracks and they were hit by a train. So he lost all his brothers and sisters, his mother and his aunt at the age of 18. And so growing up and being a man now, I kind of have to look at the way we were raised and kind of say to myself, if I was 18 and I lost my whole family, what type of man would I develop into? What type of family bonds and boundaries would I have? So that helps me in understanding a portion of my childhood. So that was my first experience with death. So it's usually a child will say, oh, somebody got sick, they got old, right. And that's how they come to it, but not thinking about losing all your brothers and sisters and your mother at one time.
So did this trigger memories when your mother informed you about your dad's news?
I think at that point, I had an okay understanding with death, just because I had to contemplate it for years. I would lay in my bed and cry to sleep, thinking not about myself dying, not about my family dying, but if I passed away, how they would respond, how sad they would be. And these were the thoughts I would have as a little kid. So that was the first tragedy. It was an accident. When I was 12, my cousin was murdered. And he was murdered in what started one of the biggest gang wars in the history of Boston. He was a gang member. He was 16 years old, and he was sitting in a car, and the person in the car next to him had said that he saw a rival gang member shoot him and kill him. And it started this huge war. I actually didn't hear about this story. Mind you, I was 12 when it happened, until I was 18, and I met somebody that was in the gang with my cousin, and he told me the story of what happened with my cousin. And the person that told me this story was in a wheelchair from a bullet that he took because of this war. He had his throat slit in the skating rink in Mattapan because of this war that started over my cousin's death. Come to find out, 3 years later, they found out that this other gang member, no rival gang member, killed my cousin. It was the person that was in the car with him that killed him. So all this violence and bloodshed that had been going on for 3 years was over nothing, but at that point it wasn't going to stop or slow down. So that was another experience that I had where I had already come to the realization that not only do things happen unexpectedly, not from death or old age, but people are actually out here doing these things to each other. So by the time, I was 13 and this story came back about my father, I actually didn't cry. I went into my bedroom, I sat on the bed, my younger brother came in and he asked me if I was all right. I told him I'll be all right. I probably processed it that that's how men were, being in an environment that was pretty safe but rough, where men hid their feelings and didn't really deal with things. And back then there was no trauma services, no trauma response, and anyone to come speak with you. The only person that came was the Boston Herald to interview me because my father was one of the only people from Massachusetts that was associated with what happened in New York. So as the story came out, this was my third lesson about death, that not only do things happen unexpectedly, not only do people do horrible things to people, but it could happen on this massive scale. So what happened was my father and my aunt went out to a nightclub. It was a social club. It's called the Happy Land Social Club. And it was an after-hours establishment. It was probably should have been shut down. It had one entrance. It wasn't regulated, no sprinkler system. A man got into an argument with his girlfriend, and she was the coat check girl. She worked at the club, so they kicked him out. From what I read, he said he's going to be back. He's going to shut the place down. He went down the street. He got $1 worth of gasoline. He put it in a can.
$1 worth.
$1 worth of gas. On a can, he found a oil can on his way. He went down, and from learning more about it over the years, I heard that they weren't supposed to sell gas to people, without a car. But he told him, my car is out of gas. I need this gas. So he got the $1 worth of gas. He went back. He threw it on the door of the club and lit it on fire, and killed 87 people, which at the time was the largest mass murder in the history of the United States.
And this was in 1990? This was
1990, so yeah, I was 13 years old. Only 5 people survived, and one of them was the woman that he intended to harm. So it was a bitter irony that he came to inflict damage on this person, and 87 other people fell victim to his acts. From what I read, he watched as the fire trucks pulled up from across the street, went home on the train, woke up one of his neighbors, I believe he was living in a boarding house in the Bronx, and told him that he had started a fire. She told him go to sleep. The police, I think, quickly ascertained what had happened from the 5 survivors, and they went to his boarding room the next day. Said he smelled of gasoline. He quickly, confessed to what had happened and probably apologized. So they took him into custody. He got the largest sentence ever in the history of New York. 2 counts of murder for each victim, so that would be 174 murder convictions.
So why did they do it as 2 counts?
You know what? I'm not quite sure.
Because it's interesting why 2 counts per person.
It would be interesting to understand that maybe one in which the act was done, the use of what he did and the scope. And I also want to set the stage for what the Bronx was in the 70s when I started going there, through the 80s. You were there, you saw it. It's a very congested area, but it was nothing compared to what it was in the 70s. This was the time when homeowners were leaving the properties that they had for years. Historically, Jewish immigrants, Irish immigrants, when the southern migration of African American ex-slaves moved into the north, into cities like Boston and New York and Chicago, the tenants that were there at the time, or the property owners, started moving out of the urban areas, the congested areas. And the property values were going so low that the home owners would burn their buildings down to just get the insurance from these buildings, so that they could just cash out. They wouldn't be able to sell it at a profit or even recoup their investments. So the arson was a big thing, and they would pay, just the local residents to set the building on fire.
This was around the same time as the nightclub fire, or?
This was probably previous, so this was, I'm thinking the 70s. I remember going down there.
So 2 decades before.
Yeah, this was when I was, I remember being in pajamas that you would zip up from the bottom up to the neck. And so that age, really young, 6, 7, 8, and being in my aunt's apartment on maybe the 8th floor and looking down into the courtyard. And you have to understand, this is South Bronx in the 1970s is where hip hop originated, where the graffiti was, where the breakdancing was, when it was nowhere else on the planet. So I got to experience that. I remember looking out the window into the courtyard, and they'd be pushing the dumpsters together, putting the speakers on top of the dumpsters, and having these huge, block parties. And I'm a hip hop historian and fan myself, so I know, who might have been in those parties and creating this culture that's now everywhere international. Is probably one of the biggest marketing tools and forms of entertainment globally now, at the Super Bowl and everything like that. But before 1970, it was non-existent, and during the 70s, it was just in this one small enclave of the South Bronx. So I feel fortunate to have witnessed that. Like I said, I grew up in poverty in Boston, but it was nothing like this South Bronx neighborhood in the 70s and 80s.
So that night in the nightclub, it wasn't just your father, right? You had another family member.
Yes, so it was my aunt as well, the one that lived in the Bronx, and both of their spouses. So my stepmother and my uncle through marriage, my aunt's uncle. So I lost 4 family members that day, but there were families that lost up to 17 members of their family all at once. There were people that were celebrating different events. There was a soccer team that was in there that was celebrating. It was around the time of the Caribbean Carnival, so it was a very big party, going on. From what I understand, the fire started in the first floor at the door. The club was on the 2nd floor. There was only one way in and one way out, and most of the victims were not burned. There was these superheated, toxic fumes that they say were toxic within moments of them being exposed to them. So I don't know. There's been reports of when the firemen went in, and there's actually a documentary that Steve Buscemi did for HBO about firefighters in New York and different challenges that they face. And there was a segment on the Happy Land. So I've watched interviews from the actual firefighters that responded, and they were never the same after. You would say they talked about not knowing why the floor was so squishy and realizing that they were walking on top of body after body. It was extremely traumatic for them, and still I think that I still don't think that they were offered the actual trauma stabilization that would be customary now to first responders that experience this type of dramatic
From what
tragedy.
I understand from reading the article, that the fire started at the front door, and then when people were trying to escape, they opened the door, and it actually was like a vacuum, right?
Yeah,
Created
so
almost
the
like
air,
a chimney effect.
Yeah, the air
where
rushed in, fed the flame.
Fed the flame, and the wood stairs and everything that would lead up to the second floor also caught on fire. Horrific. And from reading the article, it made it sound that the people on the second floor did not realize until it was too late that they only had minutes, that there was a fire on the first floor, until it was too late. And the way you found out, I'm sure, was horrific. Did you find out how it happened? Did your mother tell you exactly how, or was it simply he has passed away?
So when I said that it was the third level of death that I dealt with in this huge tragedy, this was on the news for days. It was on the front page of the newspapers for days. There would be blueprints of the club and testimony from the people that survived or the witnesses. It was following the apprehension of the person who set the fire. So I couldn't really escape it. Like I said, the Boston Globe came and wrote an article on me. I was quoted about my relationship with my father and how I felt about it. And yeah, it was pretty out there. And like I said, we lived in a tight-knit community, so it was, I think I got the sense that I was forever gonna be the tragedy story, when I would go visit because my father had more sisters here in Massachusetts, and my grandmother had come actually for the funeral with my older brother. He had still lived in Honduras, and they ended up staying. But I felt after that every time they would see me would just be a reminder of the loss that they had, and of the loss of two family members, that they raised, that they grew up around, spent more time of their life around than I did. So it was kind of hard to avoid this shadow that was lingering.
But you seem to have overcome these tragedies and trauma that you went through. If you can take a couple minutes to share that with us, because I think a lot of people would want to know, how did you as a child overcome?
I'm not so sure I overcame. I think I struggled a lot. I was fortunate. I don't want this to be a woe is me story, but I also don't want it to be a pull yourself up by the bootstraps story, because there was support systems there. There were very influential people in my life that took care of me, really. When my home wasn't safe to be in, I would stay with a teacher's home or a neighbor's home. There was people that got me into programs and activities, and I was, the vice president of the Human Rights Coalition, and I spent a summer between my junior and senior year at Northwestern in Chicago for a business program for talented minorities. So things didn't really die down there. I had more experiences. The next year I was 14 and my aunt passed away from AIDS. And when I bring that up, people will say, or they'll think she must have been living this certain lifestyle. In actuality, she wasn't. She was a Brookline police officer. Her husband was a Brookline firefighter. And she had a rare blood disease when she was a child that required a lot of transfusions before they tested for the HIV disease. So now this is my fourth wave dealing with death, that I have to watch somebody that by all rights lived an exemplary lifestyle waste away slowly, and watch my mother, her mother, tend to her, care for her, and slowly waste away. When really, like I said, this is 91, it wasn't very common. There was a lot of stigmatism to it, not a lot of support services, not a great understanding or experience.
Right.
So that was, another traumatic event. And then, I just kind of flash forward to about 6 years ago now. I had another brother that remained in Honduras. His brother and sister, they were babies when my father and their mother, so they lost both of their parents in the fire. And they were raised in Honduras by their grandparents, their maternal grandparents. My youngest brother, at the age of 21, he was kidnapped, and he was put in the trunk of a car, and he was driven 2 towns away from where he lived and tied to a tree, and he was murdered. So when people talk about this climate in these Central American countries and the violence that they're trying to escape, this is very real. It's that my father and my brother both had the same name. One tried to escape poverty there and ended up being murdered here, and one was actually probably raised in a not so bad lifestyle there, but ended up losing his life there as well. So I think it's still being young and dealing with things, and then being an adult and dealing with things. I think it's still a test all the time, and having to rectify these things. But that being said, there are, if you use the tools that people offer, the support, the care, the compassion that people offer you, and you're able to keep hope, and like I said, at that age when I was 13, I didn't cry because I had figured out that this is going to happen to everybody. And I don't think everyone at 13 needs to understand that.
Right.
But I did. And from what I had experienced in the world, I believe that they were in a better place. So I've never looked at death or loss as something tragic. I almost celebrate it like it's a release from this test of life. The people that I do mourn for are the ones that are left behind, that haven't come to this realization that I've come to. And so the first time I cried for my father was at the funeral, when my 18-year-old brother, who had just come from Honduras, was standing next to the casket with me, and I saw him crying. And I felt for him, that.
So I'm going to ask, because we're out of time, we're going to continue this conversation in our next episode.
Sure.
So thank you so much for joining us for this episode. But as you know, that this is a very personal story and really cannot be done in such a short time. What lessons you should have learned, or at least I have learned from listening to Dan's story, is, trauma affects everyone, especially the victims and the people who are left behind. And all the more reason to really look into and support mental health and people who work in mental health. And all these horror stories that we hear around the United States on mass murders and shootings, it is so much that not only survivors are celebrated, but they are supported and helped. And so please keep watching Perspectives, and we'll continue this conversation in our next episode.